Shalom everyone. Would everyone please stand? We'll start our men's law class. Let's all reverence Yahweh in prayer. Our great Father in heaven, whose name alone is Yahweh, the Almighty One who lives and reigns forever, the everlasting Father of holiness, righteousness, and truth, the supreme teacher of righteousness, the supreme lawgiver and judge over your entire creation. Great Father in heaven, this is your humble servant and son, Kohan Abel Yisrayl Hawkins, along with all of my beloved brethren of your great house, the righteous and faithful men, all of us coming together in the bond of unity, being seeds and servants and sons of our beloved pastor and overseer, the great Kohan Yisrayl Hawkins, your faithful last days anointed witness and chosen branch, and through your beloved Son, the great and righteous and faithful high priest over your house, Yeshua Messiah. We rejoice before you, Father Yahweh, for allowing us to be invited to your great house and to be educated in your way of holiness, righteousness, and truth. I pray for your continual inspiration, your guidance, and your direction, that you would continually bless your house, that you would heal and cleanse and purify your people of their infirmities and affliction, that you will stir your people to action, that we may continue to endure and persevere to the very end. We do love you, Father Yahweh. We thank you for the messenger whom you have sent here in these last days for us to learn from. We rejoice and we give you honor and praise and thanksgiving as a seed of the witness, the great Kohan Yeshua Hawkins, and in Yeshua's name we pray. Hallelujah, Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. Please be seated, everyone. This evening we'll be covering the 11th book of Yisrayl, He Who Rules as Yahweh Rules, the End of the Ages, Part 2. And we're in chapter 18 this evening. It's a beautiful sermon that was given on 11/05/2011, and the title of the sermon is "You Curse with a Curse." You curse with curse, or you are cursed with a curse, this whole nation. Number one, we are seeing the curses of Malachi chapter 3 verse 9, and also the prophecies of the blessings brought forth by the 7 works of Yahweh through Yeshua and the donkeys. What we need to always keep in mind that the great house of Yahweh has been chosen and set apart and prophesied to bring forth everlasting righteousness, peace, joy, health, and abundant living. And Yahweh sets these conditions in front of all of us here at the great house of Yahweh. And the house of Yahweh is responsible under the leadership of the 7th messenger. I want to repeat the words of our beloved overseer. He said in one of his sermons, he said, "I am the 7th messenger of this congregation. I have the scriptures to back me up. No one else can say this except me." So again, we see here that through the mouth of the inspired holy prophets of Yahweh, as we study carefully the words of the prophets, the words of the apostles, and the chief cornerstone, the great high priest over the house of Yahweh, Yeshua Messiah, we will begin to understand this beautiful plan that Yahweh has set before us. On page 160, I want to just go directly to our beloved overseer's sermon here in verse 3. Notice here, and what I want you to understand, and this is the whole purpose that Yahweh has called you to the great house of Yahweh. Yahweh has called you to train you to become teachers of righteousness, teachers of peace, and of everlasting righteousness and peace and joy. You know, brethren, the greatest and highest education that a man can ever achieve is the education in Yahweh's righteousness. And that righteousness is being taught to each and every one of us here from the 7th messenger here in these last days in the great house of Yahweh, the priest who teaches peace. So we hear and we see the plan of Yahweh unfolding. Remember what the word of Yahweh shows. The unfolding of Yahweh's laws gives light. They give understanding to the wise. And the wise are those who will turn many to righteousness. A wise son, Proverbs 13 verse 1, a wise son will value, he will highly esteem, highly treasure the every word of Yahweh. They will treasure the life-giving instructions given to them by their teacher of righteousness. And that's what a wise son will do. He will not go against the teacher, against the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. But he will be joyful and glad and thankful and appreciative, knowing that the word of Yahweh does come alive. It brings forth peace. It really awakens the innermost parts of an individual if he is willing and obedient. And if he would only humble himself here at the great house of Yahweh, Yahweh's blessings of peace and joy and rejoicing will forever accompany you all the days of one's life. But Pastor goes on to explain here, I want you to understand, actually shown in the Holy Scriptures, what I want you to understand is that the work of Yahweh, you remember, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will purify you from your iniquities. Yahweh purifies the called out ones, all the people who are willing to follow the life-giving instructions from the words of the one whom Yahweh has sent. Yahweh will purify you Sabbath after Sabbath, week after week, as we continue to walk before Yahweh in the light of His laws. So again, we see here the work that Yahweh did through His prophets, actually foretold this in advance to you so you would know His plan. You remember in Yachanan chapter 1, verse 1 and 4 and 12, in the beginning was the plan, and the plan was with Yahweh, and this plan brings forth and it produces life. In this plan was life, and that life was the light to mankind. In verse 12, Yachanan 1, verse 12 for your notes, but as many as received Him, to those He gave authority to become the sons of Yahweh. The sons, the manifestation of the sons of Yahweh being brought forth here in the great house of Yahweh. You know, one thing that Pastor brought out in one of his recent newsletters, I really appreciate everything that Pastor has wrote. You can see the inspiration of Yahweh, the guidance of Yahweh directing his every step, his every move. But in this House of Yahweh newsletter here, it says, come to Yahweh's feast, and I will show you the way to 100% peace. Come to Yahweh's feast, come to Yahweh's weekly Sabbaths. By observing Yahweh's eternal Sabbaths, the everlasting Sabbaths of peace and joy, this is what will enable you to develop Yahweh's beautiful righteous character. But Pastor challenges the inhabitants of the earth. He challenges all the people from the multitude of nations. You remember what Pastor brought out some time ago concerning from the two sons of Yasab, Ephraim and Manasseh, will come forth this multitude of nations. But I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to read that letter that Pastor wrote, the open letter to Al-Qaeda, that 9-page letter. It was a beautiful presentation. And I rejoice, and my heart's bubble over because the political leaders who are led by the religious leaders, they continue to urge the people on towards destruction. They don't have peace. They have nothing to offer. None of them practice the peaceful solution character education program. None of them practices Yahweh's laws of righteousness. Only you, brethren, the called out ones of the great house of Yahweh, is given this great one and only opportunity to prove our obedience to Yahweh. Pastor said these words, if I can do it, you can do it. If you got trouble overcoming whatever flaws or weaknesses we have in our individual lives, Pastor said, if I can do it, you can do it. So again, we have to have an attitude. We must develop an attitude of obedience here at the great house of Yahweh, always having a desire to learn the righteousness of Yahweh's laws. Remember, the house of Yahweh is built upon this everlasting foundation of the apostles, the prophets, and Yeshua Messiah himself being the chief cornerstone. But again, here in verse 3, Pastor goes on to explain here concerning the unfolding of Yahweh's plan, the manifestation of His plan. You know, the enlightening of Yahweh's plan is being taught to you, to the multitude of nations, to all of us, collectively speaking. It's for your benefit. It's for the benefit of our children. It can bring peace and joy and healthy living, healthy minds. The whole world is sick. They're cursed. Yeshua said in Yachanan 7:49 for your notes, all the people who do not know the law are cursed. So you can see if the law of Yahweh is not taught to the inhabitants of the earth, the multitude of the nations, they will continue to go in a very destructive way. This uncontrolled lust, uncontrolled anger and hatred and retaliation and vengeance is in their innermost parts. But Pastor goes on to exhort all of us concerning the branch and the donkey. Remember, the branch is the seventh messenger of Yahweh, the vine is Yeshua, and the rock is Yahweh, where that living water flows from Yahweh. directly to Yeshua, to the chosen branch that is connected to Yeshua, the vine, the chosen branch, and we, the donkey's coats, we, the called out ones of the house of Yahweh. Again, man, don't be offended when the word of Yahweh comes forth from the lectern. Rejoice and leap for joy, because the house of Yahweh, we tell it like it is, like it was, and like it will be. And that's the pattern of the kingdom of Yahweh. Yahweh's prophets never quiver. The great prophets of Yahweh never quiver. What did Yeshua say? What did you go out to see? A flimsy reed shaking in the wind? No, you will never see that here from our seventh messenger, our beloved overseer. That man I've come to respect, our beloved overseer. I've come to love him. And that's all part of our calling. That's all part of believing into the one whom Yahweh has sent. You will honor the words of your teacher. You will honor the words of the faithful messenger whom Yahweh has sent over the nations. Again, in verse 4, now we are making headways in education. And this is the key word. I really want you to write this down, because this is for our benefit and our growth in the house of Yahweh. Education in righteousness. We need to be educated in the way of holiness, righteousness, and peace. Because the whole world has been educated in the ways of Cain. Retaliation, hatred, vengeance, and murder. The shedding of innocent blood. The reason why I bring up briefly about the letter, the open letter to Al-Qaeda, you know, these men, these leaders of Al-Qaeda, Yahweh is able to reach them. Nothing is impossible with Yahweh. What is impossible with man is possible with Yahweh. It's possible to reach people, violent, vicious men. The great apostle Shaul was one of the worst of the worst. He said, I was the worst of all the saints of Yahweh. And you're looking at one of the worst ever to be called to the great house of Yahweh. And Yahweh is very merciful. He can work with the people of Al-Qaeda if they are willing to hear the messenger of the nations, the seventh messenger, the seventh trumpeter, whom Yahweh has educated in the way of holiness, righteousness, and truth. Pastor goes on to exhort all of us here. Yahweh's way is in the education of holiness. You know, when we study carefully the book of Leviticus, Leviticus was known as the book of cleansing. The book of cleansings, Leviticus 18, 19, 20, 21, all the way up to 23, up to the feast of Yahweh, the pattern of the kingdom. But the holiness of the priesthood was all part of one's cleansing, the turning away from sin and the wickedness of sin. The whole world has been educated. You have to blame the leaders, the religious leaders, the political leaders. They continue to urge the people on towards violence and anger and hatred and retaliation. There's no greater joy, as Yahweh said, I have no greater joy than to hear that my family, my children, my sons and daughters are walking in Yahweh's light. To walk in the ways of Yahweh, as you study positive law number 8, to walk in the ways of Yahweh is to imitate Yahweh, to speak the language of peace and joy and righteousness, every man to his neighbor. Ephesians 5 verse 9 for your notes. But the fruit of the light is namely all holiness, righteousness, and truth. Pastor goes on to expound here. If you could get this in your mind, you remember the mind. The mind is deceitful and desperately wicked above all things, and who can know it? And Pastor mentioned in one of his sermons, I believe was the going on to perfection. He said, within your mind is where you must overcome. Within your own mind is where you must overcome. We've got to guard our minds with all diligence. Not only your mind, but guard your eyes, guard your thoughts with all diligence, for out of it flows the righteousness of Yahweh's laws. So again, we see here, if you could get this in your heart, in your mind, in your thoughts, like for instance where Yeshua was crowned. You study, I really want to challenge all the called out ones. Study Psalms chapter 21, verses 1 to 7. Read that over and over and over again, over and over and over again, and you will see in verse 3, for Yahweh meets you and I with the blessings of righteousness, and he set a crown of pure gold upon the head of Yeshua, the great high priest. Remember, Yeshua loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore, Yahweh has anointed him with the oil of gladness above his companion and his fellow heirs. But again, Pastor goes on to explain here where Yeshua was crowned. It said, made a crown and put on his head. Actually, that is made a crown and put in his head. In other words, it's placed in his mind, in his head. Every one of you at this time, make him fit for the job. So Yahweh has called everyone here to the great house of Yahweh so that you can be perfectly fit in the work of Yahweh. This is the work of Yahweh, that you believe into the one whom Yahweh has sent. And one of the reasons why we have dysfunctional nations and people all over the world, people are fighting. I just want you to really write this down. If you have your notes, you see that word war? One of the mighty priests of Yahweh, the great righteous priests of Yahweh, the acronym for the word war is working against righteousness. I really want you to write that down and memorize it over and over and over again. Teach it to your children. Because what they're teaching the multitude of nations, they're teaching you how to clutch your hands, to clench your hands. You know, when you can clench your hands, you want to beat the crap out of somebody. That's what people are doing. That's what people have been taught. I've been taught that way. I've been taught to fight, to hurt, to destroy someone else. But it wasn't until Yahweh called me to the beautiful house of Yahweh to train me, to educate me in the way of righteousness by way of the seventh messenger of Yahweh and the great priest of Yahweh, who has taught all of us how to come out of that cesspool, that wickedness of sin. But war is working against righteousness. We cannot allow war to continue to activate our way of thinking, because Yahweh's kingdom does produce everlasting peace, joy, righteousness, and health. Healthy minds, healthy bodies. If we would only pursue the kingdom of Yahweh all the days of one's life. Here, Pastor goes on to say, he is placing in the heads of every one of you at this time, making him fit for the job. You know, Pastor is the right man for the job. He's qualified, he's authorized, he's certified, and he is approved by Yahweh. He's endorsed by Yahweh, by Yeshua, and all the words of the prophets. I love what Pastor once said, if I alone testify on my behalf, my testimony is invalid. It's worthless. If the words of the prophets, if they did not prophesy on my behalf, I would not even stand before you and proclaim the glory of Yahweh, the kingdom of Yahweh. So Pastor is true. He is the true messenger of Yahweh. I am the seventh messenger of this congregation, and I have the scriptures to back me up. No one else can lay claim to it. No one else can say this except me. And that's something that we need to always remember. Because sometimes Yahweh's people, the people of the world, you need to know your place. And that place is that we've all been deceived by our forefathers. Our parents, they've been deceived by their parents. Our fathers and our forefathers, all of them have eaten the sour grape. And the children's teeth are set on edge, filled with violence and wickedness. They want to hurt. There's over 600 plus people have been killed there in Egypt. As goes Egypt, so goes the Arab world, as one leader said. But Egypt is where that Yahweh is able to bring out a small remnant out of that group. If they are willing and obedient, if they have ears to hear, eyes to see, and a heart and a mind to understand this everlasting message that the house of Yahweh has to offer you, that the messenger of Yahweh, Yisrayl Hawkins, has to offer you, you can turn from your butchering and slaughtering. There's no reason to shed innocent blood, men, women, and children. That's not the way of the kingdom of Yahweh. The kingdom of Yahweh is a kingdom of responsibility and accountability. That's why Yahweh calls you and I here to train us how to be responsible, how to judge righteously, how to be accountable for our actions, our attitude. There's no reason to fight and to continue to fight. As Pastor said, what causes people to hurt other people? They've never been educated in the way of righteousness. Righteousness is being spread. Everlasting righteousness, peace, joy, and abundant living is being spread through the one and only house of Yahweh. The Peaceful Solution Character Education Program is spreading throughout the multitude of nations. It's up to every individual. You have a choice. It doesn't matter what region or geographical location you're from. If you would only humble yourself, if you would only reverence Yahweh by keeping His laws, you've got to watch for sin. Get it immediately. Stop it, nip it in the bud. When you teach someone not to sin, you stop sinning yourself. And I'm speaking to all the preachers of the world, all the leaders of all the kings of the earth, all of them talk about peace, but at the same time they prepare for war. And remember what war is. War is, what they're doing is working against righteousness. You know, within your own individual families, when we work against righteousness, people who work against righteousness, they cheat, they lie, they steal, they defraud their neighbor. They molest a man's wife. They seduce a man's daughter. That's why there's so much hatred and anger taking place throughout the earth. You cannot encroach and infringe on another person's property and expect to have eternal peace. It can't be accomplished. We must respect another man's possessions. But Yahweh shows that whatever a man chooses to practice, changes the DNA in that direction. Therefore, by his genes are therefore transferred to his offsprings and his children. So it's up to every individual to choose the way of righteousness, holiness, and peace. Yahweh has called us, everyone, to be responsible, to be reliable and dependable and trustworthy. There's no way that you can exist in Yahweh's presence if you try to disguise yourself. Religious imposters will be pruned out of the house of Yahweh. Never will they exist in the kingdom of Yahweh. But Yeshua received the staff, a scepter of righteousness. A scepter of righteousness is a scepter of your kingdom. A rod of chastisement, a rod of correction, which wasn't a rod, a physical rod, neither a physical crown, any more than a physical crown, but the crown of righteousness. There's so much joy in observing Yahweh's laws. That's why I said the greatest and highest education that a man can ever achieve is the education in Yahweh's righteousness. That is being taught to everyone here in the house of Yahweh, by the house of Yahweh, by the chosen branch, the seventh messenger. So again, we see here the crown of righteousness. He describes it and shows and proves that he is capable of bringing peace, everlasting peace, righteousness, and holiness throughout the inhabitants of the earth. In the self-control unit, for your notes, I believe it's on page 172, it says, war is a sign of failure. Failure to practice self-control, failure to communicate respectfully, failure to resolve conflicts peacefully, and failure to value human life. So we see here, as Pastor said, come to Yahweh's feast. Come to Yahweh's weekly Sabbath. Don't deprive yourself from this life-giving instructions from the messenger of righteousness. Don't deprive your families anymore. It's time to set your house in order. Men, women, and children. If your dad is lazy to get up, then get him up. Say, Dad, it's time for go to the great house of Yahweh. Don't be lazy and slothful anymore. We don't have no excuses whatsoever in the house of Yahweh. Pastor said, if I can do it, you can do it. He was referring to, if I can overcome, you can overcome. If I can practice righteousness, you can practice righteousness. That's the way of Yahweh's beautiful kingdom. But education in the Peaceful Solution character education program is a need. It's a must. It has to be taught throughout every village, every community, every synagogue, every mosque, every church. They need to hear the Peaceful Solution character education program. How to be responsible, reliable, dependable. How to practice self-control. How to show respect. Communicating with respect. Communicating with respect builds bridges that can last a lifetime, as one of our Peaceful Solution books has briefly explained there. But in this sermon, Pastor goes on to say, Malachi 3 verse 9, this whole earth is cursed. All nations, the nations. You remember what Pastor brought out last Sabbath? Woe to you pastors, all you preachers. Yes, I was a part of the kingdom of Christianity for 26 years of my life. And I heard the best of all the preachers, all the evangelists out there, all these preachers. I've heard them. They told nothing but lies. They don't keep Yahweh's Sabbath. They continue to eat the unclean foods. They're not no messenger of the nations or messengers of righteousness. It's time to stop the bloodshed. It's time to put down your weapons. It's time to teach our children. Don't clutch your hands anymore. Every time you start seeing that in one of our prophetic words, we had one of those little children, their hands like that. You remember that they wanted to hit somebody? But we need to stop our children from raising their hands. That's part of where they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. They will stop clutching their hands no longer. They will no longer clutch their hands. They will no longer speak curses over their neighbors. But they will speak the language of peace, the language of righteousness, every man to his neighbor. But again, we see here that Yahweh, through his 7 messenger, the 7 works of Yahweh, the 7 messenger, he shows that he will enlighten the nations. He will inspire the nations here in these last days. So again, we see here in Yochanan 17:17, for your notes, Yeshua gave this beautiful promise here to the great house of Yahweh. Remember where the great high priest and the 7th messenger, through the council of peace, they will bind together. They will work together side by side. Yochanan 17:17, sanctify them through your law. Your law is the truth. Yahweh's law is the truth. It's the reflection of perfection and the representation of Yahweh Himself. When you study carefully the beautiful laws of righteousness and peace, you're looking in the reflection of Yahweh. As a face is reflected in water, as the proverb shows, as a face is reflected in water, so a man's mind reflects the man. So sanctify them through your law. Yahweh sanctifies you. He sets you apart here in the great house of Yahweh to become teachers of righteousness. Teachers of righteousness. So again, we see here the keeping of the feast days and the Yahweh Sabbath days. It helps every individual how to govern his body, how to govern himself for the next 6 days. You get that, men? You understand that? That's the reason we come to keep our Sabbaths, appointments. How to govern your bodies, how to govern your thoughts. You learn this at the one and only house of Yahweh. It will teach you how never to hurt your neighbors. The prophecy shows in Isaiah 11 verse 9, they will not hurt nor destroy in all of my holy mountain. In conclusion, I want you to read this scripture here at your convenience. The book of Yeketskiah 43 verse 12. 43 verse 12, this is all part of the pattern of the kingdom. Yeketskiah 43 verse 12, I'll conclude here. But it reads the words of the great prophet, the mighty prophet Yeketskiah 43:12. It reads, this is the law of the great house of Yahweh. On top of the mountain and the whole area surrounding it is most holy. Behold, this is the law of the great house of Yahweh. Men, may Yahweh bless your understanding. Let's not make any excuses. And let's continue to practice Yahweh's laws of righteousness all the days of one's life. Would everyone please stand? I have the privilege and honor to present to you my beloved brother and fellow priest, the great Kohen David Hawkins.
Shalom, brethren. You all may be seated. It's an honor and a privilege to address the called out ones of Yahweh. We're going to continue where great Kohen Abel left off with the sermon from the 11th book of Israel, part 2. And I'm going to be beginning on page 164 if you have your books. I'm going to be covering some main points in this second part of the class here this evening. One of the main points is that our high priest Yeshua, the Lamb, is the one who's doing the work in these last days with the donkeys. And of course, we're the donkey's colt in these last days, working under the choicest branch, tethered to the choicest branch. And Yeshua had the apostles. They were what the scriptures referred to as the donkeys who served him. The second point I'd like to be covering this evening is Yahweh says, teach your children these laws, statutes, and judgments diligently when you rise up, when you go to bed, and so forth. In other words, constantly. It's constant repetition in teaching our children. And that's the way we learn also, through constant repetition, through attending this class here this evening, for example. The third point I'd like to cover this evening is bring all your tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food. And this doesn't mean something to eat, but it means the means to spread the message throughout the world. In other words, our tithes and offerings, our monetary increases that we've received according to the laws of Yahweh. We bring those forth here to Yahweh's work in these last days. Fourth point, you're being prepared to be recognized as Yeshua, who is recognized as being righteous. We won't turn, and so that we won't turn in a fit of anger or a bad moment or whatever to misuse the power that Yahweh wants to give us. You know, He wants us to learn total righteousness and to have the same character as Yeshua, so that we can be trusted with this power that Yahweh has, this authority. The fifth and last point is Yeshua was bred to actually grow righteousness, which would take over His total mind. He is absolutely one with Yahweh, meaning in unity with Yahweh. Yeshua put into the apostles' minds the same thing that was bred into Him. He's doing the same with us as a high priest over the house of Yahweh. So I'd like to begin in page 164 with that first point. Yeshua is the one who, and this is verse 37, Yeshua is the one who's portrayed in Genesis 49 as doing the work in the last days with the donkeys. And I'm going to skip down here to Revelation. I'm going to go to Revelation 6, chapter 6, and read that first of all out of the book of Yahweh. Revelation 6, and I'm going to begin with verse 4. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was granted to him who sat upon it to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, and there was given unto him a great sword. And let's skip down to verse 7. And when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." And we know Pastor said in a recent sermon, the four that are spoken of in the book of Revelations are the quartet. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, verse 8 of Revelation 6, and the name of him who sat upon it was Death, and Sheol, the grave, followed after him, and power was given to him over a fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, and with pestilence, which is disease epidemics, the same under the authority of the beasts of the earth. So, Pastor, he writes here, he says, the beast that he's speaking of here was the one that changed Yahweh's law, spoken of in Isaiah 24, and also in Daniel. And so I'd like to read in the book of Daniel, chapter 23. It talks about this beast that's authorizing this the wars, that's planning the wars, and it's this beastly system. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 23, this is what he says: the fourth beast will be the fourth kingdom upon the earth. You know, the three have passed away, and succeeded by the fourth one, which is the Roman Empire, and today lives on as the Catholic Church and that type of system. So the kingdom upon the earth, which will be different from all other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, and will tread it down, break it into pieces. And verse 25, and he will speak great words. This is the head of this system. The head of the system will speak great words against Yahweh, and will wear out, mentally attack, to cause to fall away the saints of Yahweh, and think to change times, Yahweh's feast days, and laws, Yahweh's Sabbath, and they will be given into his hand until a time and a dividing of times. And that's what Yahweh's work in these last days. The house of Yahweh is restoring these laws, preaching and publishing them to the entire earth at this time. And verse 26, but the judgment will sit, and they will take away his government to consume and to completely destroy it. And this is the change that we're looking for. This is when Yeshua returns, and all the kingdoms of the earth will be given into his authority. Then the kingdoms, verse 27 of Daniel chapter 7, then the kingdoms and governments and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of Yahweh, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all governments will serve and obey him, Yahweh, through Yeshua and through the 144,000 priesthood. So these things at this point, as verse 8 says, and I looked and behold a pale horse, and the name of him who sat upon it was Death, and Sheol, the grave, followed after him, and power was given unto him over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword and with hunger and with pestilence, the same under the authority of this beast of the earth. Let's move on to the second point. The second point here, and this is that Yahweh says, teach your children diligently these laws, statutes, and judgments. Teach them diligently when you rise up and when you go to bed. And actually, it's a constant process. In the word diligently in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, it's in verse 7, it says, and you must diligently teach these laws to your children. The word diligently means to point. It means intensely to pierce. It means repetition. So it's like driving home a point, and you do it constantly. That's what I've noticed about excellent teachers. They are relentless in repeating the point they're trying to make. An excellent teacher is relentless in repeating the point they're trying to make, almost to the point of it being, when you get the point, when the student gets the point, they've gotten the point. They get tired of hearing it. But that's what we as teachers of the peaceful solution, teachers of representatives of the laws of Yahweh, that's what we should remember, that this constant repetition is a critical factor in teaching children, because they're not always ready to receive the instruction. So it's the constant repetition in righteousness that, just as the Deuteronomy 6 verse 7 emphasizes, you must teach them diligently to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. Just about every opportunity, teach them diligently to your children. And that's how we learn also. So, and Pastor writes here in verse 46, he says, this is changing the subject a little bit. He says, the so-called American Indians, they brought some of these laws with them when they were fleeing, like we saw here earlier from the Holocaust. They brought some of these laws with them, and they brought the name with them to what is called the United States today. I have one example, and Pastor, he just referenced the American Indians here, but I have one example with respect to this. And back in the 1800s, there were a lot of carrier pigeons called wild pigeons, but they were birds larger than the mourning doves. But there was flocks estimated at 3 to 5 billion in the United States. 3 to 5 million birds, and these birds operated in large flocks, and so their nesting areas were concentrated, and in some respects, because they traveled in such large flocks, they were easy targets, and so eventually they were wiped out. In fact, by I think 1912, the last of them went extinct. And the reason was that after a certain number of these pigeons were killed off, they didn't reproduce anymore. But one point that the article I read on these wild carrier pigeons and pointed out was that the American Indians were very careful in these nesting areas where these birds nested, that they would only take the eggs of the young, they wouldn't take the adult females. And so that should bring to mind Deuteronomy chapter 22. I'd like to just read the Deuteronomy 22 and verses 6 and 7. If you come across a bird's nest beside the way, either in a tree or on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or on the eggs, do not take the mother with the young. Verse 7, be sure to let the mother go, then take the young for yourself, that it may go well with you, and that you may have a long life. So the American Indians, according to this article, they were very careful in keeping that law. They understood that, and they kept it. And I'm not sure what other laws of Yahweh they kept, but they had this in their understanding that they kept that law regarding the harvesting of the young, but not the mother at the same time. So I just thought I'd bring that forth as an example of what Pastor is saying here about the American Indians had some of the laws of Yahweh that they brought with them. And Pastor continues here, it was never set up in any other way that I know of to where the House of Yahweh actually had the power to teach children today, day and night, the laws of Yahweh until this time period that we're in right now. The children can come to the sanctuary and have classes, and so this is truly a blessing. In verse 8 of going back to Revelation chapter 6 and verse 8 about this pale horse, Pastor says, so we see that they're wanting death to 4/5 of the earth's population, starting in that area right now. And he said, this is not a new thing, depopulating the earth. And Malachi Martin showed this, and Malachi Martin showed the ones they hope to kill off. They don't want, as he said, anyone, they don't want living, I'm going to add that word, anyone who won't, or who will refuse to worship the Queen of Heaven, Satan is going to make war against them. I'm not sure if that's exactly what's occurring in Egypt right now, but there's certainly a lot of civil unrest and death going on in Egypt right now with their struggles with the governments, which is basically, I think, a religious struggle. But continuing here, in verse 12 of Revelation chapter 6, and I looked when he had opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And verse 14, and the heaven departed as a scroll. So, moving over to page 166, if you're following along in the book, Pastor writes, but they're also doing it, power is given to them, which means they've made a decision to follow, and they have the power to do it, capable of doing it, to depopulate the earth. And that's going to be one result of the wars, the nuclear wars that are coming, that 4/5 of the earth's population will not survive the nuclear wars, the famines, the pestilence that are coming in this planned war that's coming. Now that's what Pastor writes, he's showing you in this part of the curse of the four horns that Yahweh had put in front of all of Israel, saying to them, this is what your sins are bringing, it's bringing death. In verse 15 of Revelation 6, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, this is surely speaking of the great 8, the great 28, the great 10% that own 99% of the wealth, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man sought protection for themselves in their governments and in their assemblies, the houses of their gods. Okay, moving on to another point that we'll be covering in this second part here. It has to do with tithes and offerings. And in Malachi chapter 3, verse 9, it says, For you have robbed me. And Pastor writes, that is, robbed the source of knowledge that would have kept you from this hell that you're bringing forth here on the face of the earth in this time period. And it certainly is a tumultuous time in the earth, and it's only going to get worse. as the prophets have spoken, that things will continue to deteriorate in these last days. And verse 10 of Malachi chapter 3, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food, that is the means. It doesn't mean something to eat. He's not talking about food, but he's talking about increase, money, offerings. That doesn't mean something to eat. It doesn't mean food that you eat, but the means to spread the message. The means to promote the message throughout the world at this time, and that takes money. It takes income to spread the message out to the world. And the scripture continues, in my house, and prove me now, says Father Yahweh. And Yahweh certainly has the ability to bless us, and he does. And Pastor writes here, and he said, you're refusing to ask for the things that are actually needed. So that's the difference. There are some things that we may desire, that we may even lust after, that we really actually don't need. So when in our prayers, we ask Yahweh for the things that we actually need. Food, shelter, clothing, transportation, the things that are necessary to maintain us and to promote the work in these last days. And verse 11, and I will rebuke the devourer, Yahweh says. And we know that Yahweh will protect us. He will protect his house, his work, and us, his people. Going on to Genesis 49 now. And Pastor says, let's go back now to Genesis 49, and I'd like to read a couple of the several of the verses from Genesis 49. First of all, Pastor reads verse 7. He says, the verse 7, it says, cursed be their anger. And in Genesis 49, pastors talk, or the scriptures are talking first specifically about Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. So, but in the sermon, pastor's referring to these brothers as probably representatives of the symbols of violence you see in the earth today, the 12 tribes and the violence that they represent. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter into their counsel, their father said about them. Let my glory not be joined to their assembly, for in anger they killed a man, and for their pleasure they hamstrung an ox. Verse 7, cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I watched a segment of the news on what's going on in Egypt tonight, and you can see the cruelty. You can see these men being shot, killed. You can see the cruelty in it all. Death broadcast worldwide. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them throughout Israel. And this occurred. The 12 tribes were dispersed throughout the earth, and they're dispersed at this very time. So, and then going down to verse 11 here, verse 10 talks about the scepter. The scepter will not depart from Yada. Verse 8, it says, Yada. These are the words that Jacob wrote about his son Yada. Yada, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Yada. You return to the prey, my son, like a lion. He crouches and lies down like a lion's breed. Who dares to rouse him? The men of the tribe of Yada were warriors. In verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Yada, nor the ruling staff, lawgiver, from between his feet, until he comes to whom tribute belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. So here, this pastor is talking about the scepter will not depart from Yada. And he writes, he says that Yada is going to actually remain a distinct nation separate from the other 11. Well, when King Solomon died, the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes were split, as Yahweh prophesied. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, he maintained the kingdom with its capital at Jerusalem, and with the tribe of Yada and the tribe of Benjamin. And the other 10 tribes under Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, they split off and were the northern kingdom with their capital at Samaria. And so the Sumerian kingdom ceased to be a kingdom, being destroyed by the Assyrians long before the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Yada. So the pastor's talking about here. He says Yada, the distinct tribe, brought this forth in Jerusalem in the temple until Yeshua came. But he also says, but they would remain separate and have to hang on to this, but they would keep giving these laws until the time period, and this is what took place in the temple. So the scepter did not depart from Yada until Yeshua came. The scepter will not depart from Yada, nor the ruling staff, the lawgiver, from between his feet, until he comes to whom tribute belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Yeshua came from the tribe of Yada. In Hebrews chapter 7, for it is evident, and verse 14, for it is evident that our high priest descended out of Yada, of which tribe Moshe spoke nothing concerning priesthood. And this becomes more plainly evident when another priest arises who bears the likeness of Melchizedek, speaking of Yeshua, who has become a priest not on the basis of a command concerning his physical ancestry, but on the basis of the doctrine which leads to eternal life. For he testifies to Yeshua, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So he was a priest of righteousness after the order of Melchizedek, but his genealogy was of the tribe of Yada. And with respect to the scepter here, Pastor says, the scepter, it's a breeding program right here that he has specified is going to take place. It's going to breed total righteousness into one man. Now it's brought it to some others. It's brought righteousness to families. They have to guard the breeding program and make sure somebody else didn't get in to defile it. And we see many scriptural examples of how Yahweh guarded Yeshua's genealogy so that it wasn't defiled. And they have to guard the breeding program and make sure somebody else didn't get in to defile it, like the man who took his father's bed and went into his concubine. And there, of course, he's referring to Jacob's son Reuben, who defiled his father's bed by lying with the Jacob's concubine. Moving in verse 66 here, Pastor writes, and when this was taking place in Egypt and in Libya, he's talking about the hatred. And this was 2 years ago the sermon was given. When this was taking place in Egypt and in Libya, did you realize the hatred there in the minds and the faces of the people? You can see it in their faces. They didn't even give them the opportunity to get their children out of the way. And this reminds me of what the way the news is going these days. He says they did warn people back when Big Boy, and he's talking about the first atomic bombs here. He says they did warn people back when the big boy and the little fat boy, these were the names of these first atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first 2 atomic bombs. The pastor writes here, they dropped leaflets from planes saying, "Get your children out of here and your women, those you don't want to die. Get them out of this city. We're going to drop bombs on your city." And he's just pointing out that they don't even do that these days. You know, they don't. They're not so kind as to even give people a warning. The fourth point here is you're being prepared to be recognized as Yeshua, righteous, so that you won't turn in a fit of anger or bad moment and zap somebody after Yahweh gives you authority. And so this is pastor writes here, "And I can see you overcoming. I saw this at the feast, and Yeshua saw it before the feast and showed me that donkey in the cloud, a magnificent sight that I'm jumping up and down with joy about right now." Pastor writes, after I finally realized what this donkey cloud, that it didn't just occur when I first saw it, I thought, really, there's something strange like Mary, the appearances of Mary in the cloud, but these clouds, but then I looked at that cloud and I stared at it, and I said, man, this cloud's not moving. And so he said, it went in my mind, the cloud is stationary. And I said, this is not real. Then I saw the pack on the back of the donkey, well, if it was a cloud, why so much detail? Why so much detail? The only thing that puzzled me for so long about the cloud was the cloud in front of it. And then he goes on to explain how after 3-4 weeks it became clear that this cloud standing in front of the donkey was the olive tree that was used in other House of Yahweh literature. I saw the picture that our television crew, Kohan Ilya and his crew had, but I saw that picture of the olive tree sitting on top of the sign, and so he came to understand the whole understanding of the donkey and the cloud before the olive tree became clear after a while, and what a blessing that was. The last point I'd like to make here is going on to this this fifth point. Yeshua, who was bred to receive, to actually like to just follow up on that with, in Isaiah. If I can find my notes on that. Okay, yes. Going back to Genesis 49 and verse 10, with respect to Yada, the scepter will not depart from Yada, nor the ruling staff, lawgiver, from between his feet, until he comes to whom tribute belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Tethering his donkey to the vine, this is speaking of the apostles, tethered to Yeshua, and his donkey's colt, speaking of us, the men, the women, the children of the house of Yahweh, his donkey's colt to the choicest branch, who is a great Kohan, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins, the overseer of the house of Yahweh, Yahweh's elect in these last days. Tethering his donkey's colt to the choicest branch, he will wash his garments in wine, and he will wash his robes in the blood of grapes. The last, just to conclude here, I'd like to, with this last point here, the commentators all know that this is a separate work and distinct from all others that have been prophesied. They just don't know who, and but they do know that this is a separate work, and they admit that all writings and historians do. also. So just for your homework, look up Isaiah 42 verse 1 and then in reference to what we just read there about this being a separate work and under the direction of Yahweh's servant, Yisrayl Abel Hawkins. So we're going to close there this evening. If you'd all please stand, we'll conclude with the prayer. Heavenly Father Yahweh, this is your servant Kohan David Hawkins, coming to you as a seed, coming to you through the body of priests of the great house of Yahweh, through the witness, great Kohan Yisrael Abel Hawkins, and through our great high priest Yeshua. Coming before you here as the Sabbath is approaching, Heavenly Father Yahweh, and we do thank you for this class and for each and every law of your 613 laws. We ask your blessings upon your work in these last days. I ask you to put a hedge of protection around the witness Yisrael Hawkins and all of us, his seed. I ask that you heal those who are sick among us, and that your blessings of peace and joy and the blessings required to complete your work in these last days would be upon the witness and all of us, his seed. We ask these blessings and thank and praise you in Yeshua's name. Hallelujah, Yahweh.